Something happened to the American economy, and you can feel it even if you cannot name it. You walk into the grocery store, and something is different. Not just the prices, something about the experience. The packages are smaller, but the prices are the same or higher. The brands you trusted for 20 years have been replaced by private label alternatives that appeared out of nowhere. The checkout line has been replaced by a self-checkout machine that makes you do the work the cashier used to do. The parking lot has fewer cars than it should for a Thursday afternoon. You drive home and you pass strip malls with empty storefronts that used to be full. You pass a gas station where the price changed twice this week. You pass a neighborhood where you know 3 families moved out in the past 6 months because they could not afford the rent anymore. And when you get home and you sit down and you try to explain to someone what is wrong, you cannot find the word. Because the word is not inflation. Inflation is a symptom. The word is not recession. We are not technically in a recession. The word you are looking for is structural. Something structural has changed about the American economy. The rules that governed how money moved, how jobs worked, how the middle class sustained itself, how retirement was funded, how healthcare was accessed, how housing was affordable, how small businesses competed, how wages kept pace with costs, those rules have been rewritten. Quietly, incrementally, over a period of years. And the economy you are living in right now is not the economy you were told you live in. It is a different machine, built for different people, running on different fuel. And the feeling you have, the one you cannot name, is the feeling of living inside a machine that was not designed for you. America now operates 2 completely separate economies, and nobody admits they split. As 2026 began, the Fulcrum published an analysis that said what every American already knew but no one in an official capacity would say. The United States is operating in 2 financial realities: record corporate profits and soaring stock values for the wealthy, alongside deepening hardship for millions of ordinary households. Nearly half of all national consumption now comes from high-income households, whose spending on luxury goods and premium travel masks the growing struggles of families at the lower end of the income distribution. Online sales surged to $11.8 billion on Black Friday. Holiday spending exceeded $1 trillion for the first time. And at the exact same time, millions of Americans lost health insurance coverage because the ACA tax credits expired. Low-income households had their winter food budgets slashed, and the average household absorbed an additional $2,400 per year in tariff costs. RBC Wealth Management documented the mechanism behind this split with surgical precision. High-income households benefited from higher interest rate environments through higher returns on savings and from surging stock and housing markets that increased their wealth. Low-income and middle-income households largely missed out on those wealth gains and felt larger inflationary burdens because rent and food price increases are disproportionately painful when rent and food consume 60 to 70% of your income. All-cash homebuyers accounted for nearly 30% of real estate transactions in late 2025, a near-record high. Those buyers, often investors or wealthy retirees, are immune to mortgage rate fluctuations. They are crowding out first-time homebuyers who face the twin barriers of high prices and high interest rates. GovFacts described the housing market as structurally paralyzed. Over 60% of mortgages carry an interest rate below 4%, locking homeowners into their current homes because moving would mean trading a 3% rate for a 6% one. This is not a business cycle. This is a structural partition. 2 economies occupying the same geography, using the same currency, measured by the same GDP number, but experienced in completely different ways by completely different populations. And the GDP number, the unemployment rate, and the stock market indices that are reported on the evening news describe the economy of the top third. The economy of the bottom 2/3 is invisible in those numbers. It lives in the credit card delinquency data, in the SNAP enrollment numbers, in the food bank line lengths, in the number of families doubling up in apartments because they cannot afford their own, in the number of prescriptions that were not filled because the copay was too high. That economy does not appear on CNBC. It does not ring the opening bell on the NYSE. It does not show up in the GDP print. But it is where the majority of Americans actually live. And the statistical instruments that measure the economy were designed for one economy, not 2. RBC documented that soft data like consumer surveys has become much less valuable as a forecasting tool because it effectively oversamples low and middle-income households over high-income households who are disproportionate spenders. Which means consumer sentiment can collapse to record lows while GDP continues to grow because the spending that drives GDP is concentrated in the top third of the income distribution, and their sentiment is fine. Their stock portfolios are up, their home equity is growing. Their savings earn 4 to 5% interest. Their 401k balances crossed new highs. And the Federal Reserve, which makes policy based on aggregate data, is looking at a GDP number that says the economy is growing and an inflation number that says prices are elevated but cooling. And they are making interest rate decisions based on an economy that does not exist for the majority of the people who live in it. The economy that the Fed sees is the economy of the top third. The economy that the bottom two-thirds experiences is invisible to the policy apparatus that is supposed to manage it. That is not a temporary condition. That is a structural failure of the measurement system itself. And until the measurement system is redesigned to distinguish between the two economies that now occupy the same country, every policy decision will be optimized for the wrong population. Small businesses are dying while monopolies grow, and job deserts are replacing job markets. During November and December 2025, large companies with more than 50 employees created approximately 90,000 jobs. Small businesses with fewer than 50 employees eliminated 120,000. The majority of the American private sector workforce is employed by small businesses, which means the sector that employs the most people is the sector that is shrinking. The Fulcrum described the result as job deserts forming in communities across the country as small businesses close and are not replaced. The trend of consolidation means large companies accumulate more pricing power, more market share, more political influence, and more ability to suppress wages, while ordinary people are left with fewer employers to choose from, less leverage to negotiate pay, and diminishing options for where to work and what to buy. 4 companies control 85% of American beef processing. 3 control 63% of pork. 2 control 47% of chicken. 3 pharmacy benefit managers control 80% of the prescription drug supply chain. 4 airlines control 80% of domestic air travel. 2 companies control 72% of the American beer market. This level of concentration was illegal under antitrust law for most of the 20th century. It is now the standard operating structure of the American economy, and the consequences are visible in every consumer interaction. When 4 companies control your meat supply, they set the price. When 2 companies control your beer, they set the price. When 3 companies control your prescriptions, they set the price. You are not shopping in a market. You are accepting terms from a monopoly that has been allowed to consolidate because the regulators who were supposed to prevent it were captured by the industries they were supposed to regulate. And the small businesses that would have competed with those monopolies, that would have offered alternative products at alternative prices, that would have hired the workers those monopolies refused to hire at competitive wages, are closing at a rate of 120,000 jobs per month. The American economy was built on competition. That competition has been systematically eliminated. And the prices you are paying, the wages you are earning, and the choices you are not being given are the direct result. Nearly every new job in America is in one sector, and when that sector slows down, there is nothing behind it. Stanford, the Roosevelt Institute, RBC, and the Philadelphia Fed all documented the same extraordinary fact about the American labor market in 2025 and into 2026. Nearly 90% of net private job creation occurred in a single sector: healthcare. Strip healthcare out of the employment data, and the American private economy has essentially stopped creating jobs. The Roosevelt Institute's analysis was devastating. They wrote that 2025 is likely to be the worst year for job growth outside a recession in decades. The February 2026 annual benchmark revision was projected to mean 911,000 fewer jobs in 2025, potentially turning job growth negative for the year. Negative. Not slowing. Negative. The economy may have actually lost jobs in 2025 once the revisions are complete. And the healthcare jobs that are being created are not evidence of a thriving economy. RBC documented that they are a structural response to an aging population, not a cyclical indicator of economic strength. America is getting older. Older people need more healthcare, so the healthcare sector hires more workers. That is demographics, not dynamism. And those healthcare jobs are also insulated from the normal business cycle, which creates an illusion of stability. When the next contraction comes, the healthcare sector will continue hiring regardless of what happens to the rest of the economy, which means the unemployment rate will understate the severity of the downturn. The traditional indicators are lying to you. Not because the data is fabricated, but because the structure of the economy has changed so fundamentally that the old indicators no longer measure what they used to measure. A low unemployment rate used to mean the economy was strong and that people who wanted jobs could find good ones. In 2026, a low unemployment rate means that 3 million workers have been removed from the labor force through retirement and immigration enforcement. That supply has contracted to meet falling demand, and that the jobs being created are concentrated in a single sector driven by demographics rather than growth. RBC called this stagflation light. The Roosevelt Institute called it a vibe shift. Stanford called it waiting for clarity. I would call it something simpler. I would call it a different economy wearing the old economy's clothes. And the consequences for young Americans are already catastrophic. The Roosevelt Institute documented that the unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds has been above 10% and rising for 6 months. The share of unemployed workers out of a job for 6 months or more is tied with the pre-2009 record. RBC noted that the 20 to 24-year-old unemployment rate rose 1.2 percentage points from a year ago, while the rate for prime-age workers was unchanged. Young workers are being locked out of the labor market at rates not seen since the aftermath of the Great Recession, and the entry-level positions that previous generations used as launching pads into careers are being automated, offshored, or simply not created. The University of Michigan survey has asked households every month since 1997 what they think the odds are of losing a job in the next 5 years. There have been only 3 months in more than 2 decades of measuring in which people felt more afraid of job loss than they did in November 2025. The New York Fed reports that consumers have become much more worried about missing debt payments. The fear is not just about prices anymore, it is about jobs. And the shift from price anxiety to job anxiety is the most important economic signal in America right now, because it means the consumer, who drives 70% of GDP, is beginning to contract not because things cost too much, but because they are afraid they will not have income at all. Corporate profits hit record highs while wages fell behind, and nobody connected those two facts on television. Corporate profit margins in 2025 were among the highest in American history. Companies used the cover of inflation to raise prices beyond what their own cost increases justified. Researchers have documented that more than half of the price increases in 2023 and 2024 were driven by margin expansion, not cost pass-through. Companies raised prices because they could, not because they had to. And they could, because of the concentration I just described. When 4 companies control 85% of beef processing, no single consumer can punish them by switching to a competitor, because there are only 4 competitors, and they all raised prices in the same quarter. That is not a free market. That is an oligopoly, behaving exactly the way oligopolies have always behaved in every economy in the history of the world. And the profits generated by those price increases did not flow to workers. Real wage growth for non-supervisory employees barely kept pace with inflation in 2025. The gains that were reported in the aggregate data were skewed by high earners in technology, finance, and healthcare, whose salary increases pulled the average upward while the median remained flat. The fulcrum documented that workers in retail, agriculture, and hospitality still experience stagnant or decreasing wages in real terms. Income inequality has increased with cost of living adjustments falling behind in most areas, especially for young workers and those without college degrees. And the profits that did not go to workers went to shareholders through record stock buybacks and dividend increases. In 2025, S&P 500 companies spent over $900 billion on share repurchases. That is money that could have funded wage increases, capital investment, research and development, or employee benefits. Instead, it was used to reduce the share count, which mechanically increases earnings per share, which increases the stock price, which increases the wealth of the executives whose compensation is tied to stock performance. The loop is closed, prices rise, profits increase, profits fund buybacks. Buybacks increase stock prices, executives who own stock get richer, workers who earn wages do not. And the economy that is described on television, the one with record stock market highs and strong corporate earnings, is the economy of the people inside that loop. The economy of the people outside of it is invisible, and the mechanism that makes it invisible is the same mechanism that makes it profitable. When the evening news reports that the stock market hit a new high, they are reporting a number that is relevant to the approximately 52% of Americans who own stocks, predominantly through retirement accounts. But the top 10% of Americans own 87% of all stock market wealth, which means the stock market high is overwhelmingly a measurement of how wealthy the already wealthy are becoming. When the GDP number is reported as growing at 2.2%, it is measuring the total economic output of the country, which includes the luxury spending, the AI data center investment, the financial services revenue, and the defense spending that are driving growth. It is not measuring the lived experience of the family that spent $1,400 on groceries this month instead of $900 5 years ago. The numbers that describe the economy and the numbers that describe your life have diverged. And they diverged because the economy was restructured to optimize for the numbers that appear on television rather than the numbers that appear on your receipts. Retirement was redesigned from a guarantee into a gamble, and most Americans lost the bet. In 1980, approximately 38% of private sector workers had a defined benefit pension, a guaranteed monthly check for life funded by their employer. By 2025, that number had fallen below 15%, with the vast majority of remaining pension plans concentrated in government, utilities, and legacy unionized industries. The 401k, which was introduced in 1978 as a supplemental savings vehicle, was never designed to be the primary retirement system for the American workforce. It was designed as a tax shelter for corporate executives who wanted additional savings options beyond their existing pensions. Over 4 decades, employers systematically eliminated pensions and replaced them with 401k plans, transferring the entire risk of retirement funding from the corporation to the individual worker. The worker now bears the investment risk, the longevity risk, the inflation risk, and the behavioral risk of managing their own retirement savings with no training, no professional guidance unless they pay for it, and no guaranteed outcome. And the results of that transfer are now visible. The median 401k balance for Americans aged 55 to 64 is approximately $89,000. At a 4% withdrawal rate, which is the standard recommendation for sustainable retirement income, $89,000 generates $3,560 per year, $297 per month. That is the private retirement income available to the median American approaching retirement age, $300 a month. Add Social Security's average benefit of $1,907, and the total is $2,204 per month. The average rent in America is $2,100. Which means the median American retiree's combined income from Social Security and their 401k does not cover rent. Before food, before healthcare, before utilities, before transportation, before anything. The pension promised you a floor, the 401k promised you a chance, and for the median American worker, the chance did not work out. Not because they were irresponsible, because the system was redesigned to transfer risk from the institution that could absorb it to the individual who could not. That is not a market failure. That is a design choice. And it was made by the same corporations that used the savings from eliminating pensions to fund the stock buybacks that enriched their executives. The retirement system was not broken. It was replaced with something cheaper for the employer and worse for the worker. And 40 years later, the bill for that replacement is coming due for an entire generation that was told the 401k would take care of them. Fiscal policy now runs on contradictions that cancel each other out and leave ordinary people paying for both sides. All Habtoor Research Center published an analysis that described the current American fiscal structure in terms that no domestic institution has been willing to use. They wrote that the economy is structurally strained, functioning under the duress of 2 massive contradictory policies. It is being stimulated by a $4.1 trillion deficit-financed tax cut through the OBBA, while simultaneously being taxed by $4 trillion in new tariffs. This policy war creates a highly unstable forecast. The 2026 economy is a sugar high from the OBBA tax cuts that will fade by 2027 to 2028, revealing an economy that has not fixed its core problems. And the 2025 policies have locked in a structurally high $1.8 trillion annual deficit, accelerated the $38 trillion national debt, and deepened the nation's net indebtedness to the rest of the world. Read that structure carefully. The government cut taxes by $4.1 trillion, which increases the deficit. To partially offset the deficit, the government imposed $4 trillion in tariffs, which are taxes on imports that are ultimately paid by American consumers. The tax cut benefits primarily flow to higher-income households and corporations. The tariff costs are disproportionately borne by lower-income and middle-income households who spend a larger share of their income on imported goods. The net effect is a transfer. The top of the income distribution receives a tax cut. The bottom of the income distribution pays for it through higher prices on consumer goods. And the deficit, which is the gap between the two, is financed by issuing debt that will be repaid by future taxpayers, who are disproportionately workers rather than asset owners. The fiscal structure of the United States in 2026 is designed to borrow money from the future, give it to the present in the form of tax cuts for the wealthy, and charge the cost to the present in the form of tariffs on the working class. That is not a policy, that is a mechanism. And the mechanism has been locked in by legislation that cannot be reversed without 60 Senate votes that do not exist. And the economy is being propped up by unsustainable borrowing, while its productive capacity is being constrained by inflationary trade barriers. The CBO forecasts that the OBBA has little to no sustained positive effect on the long-term growth rate because the temporary boost in demand fades and higher debt crowds out investment. The sugar high ends, the debt remains, and the tariffs remain. And the American household that absorbed both costs, the tariff on the way in and the debt service on the way out, is left in an economy that has been restructured around their extraction rather than their prosperity. And that is what changed. Not the prices, not the inflation rate, not the unemployment number. What changed is the architecture. The economy used to be designed, imperfectly and incompletely, around the premise that growth should broadly benefit the people who generated it. Workers produced goods and services. They were compensated with wages that rose roughly in proportion to their productivity. They were protected by pensions, by unions, by antitrust enforcement, by a social safety net that caught them when the business cycle contracted. Those structural features have been systematically removed, one by one, over 40 years. Pensions were replaced by 401ks, onions were broken, antitrust enforcement was abandoned, the safety net was cut, and in their place, a new architecture was built. An architecture where corporate profits are maximized through consolidation and pricing power, where wages are suppressed through labor market concentration and the threat of automation, where retirement risk is transferred to individuals, where healthcare costs are shifted to patients, where housing is treated as an investment vehicle rather than a place to live, where the stock market measures the prosperity of asset owners rather than the prosperity of the country, where GDP growth is fueled by deficit spending that benefits the top and tariff taxation that burdens the bottom, where 90% of new jobs are in one sector driven by demographics, and where the traditional indicators of economic health no longer measure what they used to measure. That is what they changed. And you feel it every time you walk into a grocery store, every time you open an insurance bill, every time you check your 401k balance, every time you drive past a closed business, every time you apply for a job that does not exist anymore, every time you do the math on your retirement and the numbers do not add up. The economy was changed, you were not told, and now you are living inside the result. Share this video with every American who feels it but cannot name it, because naming it is the first step toward understanding it. And understanding it is the first step toward demanding that it change back, because the economy does not have to work this way. It was made to work this way, by people, through decisions, and decisions can be reversed. If enough people understand what was decided, and by whom, and at whose expense,